Michael Turner, a former Marine-turned-police officer, and his loyal German Shepherd canine partner Shadow walked into Riverton Children's Hospital on a gray winter morning to investigate a theft of medical equipment. But as they passed the pediatric ward, Michael stopped in his tracks. On a cold plastic bench sat a young mother, trembling, her face buried in her hands as tears streamed down. Inside the room behind her 8-year-old son lay battling cancer, with doctors saying he had only 6 months left to live. When Shadow quietly padded into the room, the boy's tired eyes flickered with a fragile spark of hope, and his small hand reached out. Michael and Shadow could never have imagined that a routine investigation would turn into a journey that changed all of their lives forever. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The snow in Riverton, Colorado had fallen all night, transforming the mountain town into a muted landscape of white ridges and silver roofs. By morning, the streets glistened under a gray sky, cars moving carefully along icy lanes. A chilled wind blew off the Rockies and cut through the narrow streets, carrying the scent of pine and exhaust. Michael Turner parked his patrol SUV near the entrance of Riverton Children's Hospital, wiped the frost from his badge, and adjusted his navy winter patrol jacket. He could see his breath when he exhaled, sharp white plumes in the freezing air. At 35, Michael carried himself with the steadiness of someone who had been under fire before. He had served as a Marine in Afghanistan and returned home to become a police officer, trading desert heat for mountain cold. His hair was short and dark, touched at the temples with early gray, and his storm gray eyes missed nothing. He opened the back door of the SUV and Shadow leapt down, paws sinking into a shallow drift of snow. Shadow was his partner, a 5-year-old male German Shepherd with a sable and black coat and a compact, muscular build. His amber eyes scanned the parking lot, ears flicking at the sound of an ambulance backing up. The dog wore a black harness with K9 unit stitched on both sides, but in this moment he looked less like a police dog and more like an alert guardian at Michael's side. Michael clipped the leash to Shadow's harness and spoke softly, "Easy, boy." This is just a hospital. Shadow's tail wagged once, but his posture stayed taut, always ready. They had come here for an investigation. Over the last 2 weeks, Riverton Children's Hospital had reported several pieces of high-value medical equipment stolen: a portable ultrasound, 2 infusion pumps, and a box of new pediatric monitors. No signs of forced entry, no surveillance footage clear enough to identify a culprit. The hospital administrator had finally asked the Riverton Police Department for help. Michael was assigned to lead the inquiry, and since Shadow had a nose sharper than any scanner, the K9 unit was along. Inside, the hospital air was warm and dry. The lobby was decorated for the season. Garlands draped over reception, a fake fireplace screensaver glowing on the waiting room monitor. Volunteers in red vests poured hot cocoa for visitors. The smell of antiseptic and cinnamon mixed strangely in the hallways. Michael showed his badge at the front desk, clipped a visitor tag to his jacket, and started down the corridor with Shadow at heel. His boots squeaked softly on polished tile. Holiday music drifted from a speaker overhead, muted but cheery, incongruent with the quiet tension that lived inside these walls. He'd known that tension before, in field hospitals overseas, where lives hung by a thread and silence had weight. Hand-drawn pictures from pediatric patients lined the walls, bright crayon rainbows and smiling stick figures under suns and stars. Michael slowed at a drawing of a police dog with angel wings. "Looks like you, partner," he murmured to Shadow. The dog sniffed the air, head tilting, and wagged his tail once as if in agreement. They were supposed to head toward the lower wing where the thefts had occurred, but something at the edge of Michael's vision made him pause. Years of training had taught him to notice more than most: the hunched shoulders, the quiver of a hand, the subtle scent of salt from tears. On a hard plastic bench under a flickering fluorescent light sat a woman. Her coat was buttoned all the way up, but the fabric was thin and worn at the elbows. Her brown hair was tied back hastily, strands falling around her pale face. Her hands clutched a tissue that had been twisted into a damp, shredded ball. At her feet rested a canvas tote bag full of children's books, crayons, and a folded blanket. She sat like someone who had forgotten how to stand, shoulders rounded inward, gaze fixed on nothing. Michael slowed his pace, shadow matching him. The woman looked to be in her early 30s. She had that look he'd seen in military families, exhaustion mixed with vigilance, as though she might spring up at any moment yet lacked the strength. He felt a tug of recognition in his chest, an echo of another hospital years ago when his younger brother had died overseas and Michael had sat with his mother in a similar corridor, feeling equally helpless. He approached with care. "Ma'am," he said softly, "are you all right?" The woman startled, blinking up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but still sharp. She tried to summon a smile, but it faltered. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You just surprised me." Shadow, sensing her distress, moved ahead of Michael without a command. He padded closer to the bench, his head low, ears relaxed, posture non-threatening. He stopped just short of the woman's knees and gazed up at her with steady eyes. She looked down at him, startled at first and then softened. Her hand hovered above his head, then touched the fur behind his ears. "He's beautiful," she murmured. "Your dog?" "Shadow," Michael said, crouching slightly so his eyes were level with hers. "My partner. I'm Officer Michael Turner. We're here on an investigation about some missing equipment, but it looks like you're waiting for news." She swallowed, fingers still buried in Shadow's coat. "My name is Sarah Collins," she said quietly. "I'm 32. My son is in the room just down the hall." Her voice trembled. "Lucas, he's 8. She took a shaking breath. "He's been fighting cancer for 2 years. Her lips pressed together until they were white. "This morning the doctors told me." She hesitated, then forced the words out. "They said he might have only 6 months left." The hallway seemed to contract around them, the sounds of the hospital dimming. Michael's stomach tightened. He didn't speak right away. He simply nodded, a soldier acknowledging another soldier's wound. Shadow gave a low, almost inaudible whine and pressed closer to the woman. He nudged her thigh gently with his muzzle, then lowered his great head onto her lap, resting it there as though he'd always belonged. Sarah's hand trembled once more, then steadied, fingers curling into the dog's fur. For a moment, no one moved. Snow drifted past the window at the end of the corridor, flakes spiraling down like sifted ash. Michael watched the dog and the woman, a silent tableau of comfort in a world of machines and cold tile floors. His badge weighed heavy on his chest. He had come here for a theft investigation, but now he stood in the presence of something far more urgent. He thought of his younger brother, of hospital corridors far from home, of prayers whispered into stale air. He thought of how sometimes a dog could cross a bridge no human words could reach. Shadow, he realized, had done more in 30 seconds than Michael could do in a dozen sentences. Michael cleared his throat softly, but said nothing yet. Some moments weren't meant to be filled with words. Michael straightened from his crouch beside Sarah and took a steadying breath. Snow drifted silently outside the long hospital windows, the flakes blurred like moving stars. The corridor was hushed except for the occasional beep of monitors from nearby rooms. He glanced at Shadow, who still had his head on Sarah's lap, and gave a small nod. The German shepherd lifted his head, ears flicking, then sat back on his haunches as if waiting for instruction. Michael spoke softly to Sarah. "If it's all right with you, ma'am, I'd like to meet your son." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Her coat looked even thinner now, the buttons straining at the seams, but she nodded. "Please. He loves dogs. Maybe it will give him some light today." Her voice carried both hope and fear. She rose from the bench and led them toward the door at the end of the hall. Michael reached the door and knocked gently. Inside, he could hear the low hum of a machine and the faint sound of children's television. He opened the door slowly, holding it for Sarah to enter first. The room was painted in muted blues and greens, an attempt to seem cheerful. A hand-drawn poster of superheroes taped to the wall fluttered slightly in the draft. In the center of the room lay Lucas Collins, 8 years old, small beneath the hospital blankets. His hair was a fine blonde fuzz, regrowth from months of treatment, and his skin was pale as parchment. A thin IV line trailed from his arm to a pump at his bedside. Despite it all, there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes as he looked up. Michael kept his voice low and calm. "Hi there. My name's Michael Turner. I'm with the police department, and this is my partner, Shadow." He gestured to the dog at his side. Shadow moved forward slowly, almost cautiously, his big paws silent on the polished floor. He stopped just short of the bed and tilted his head, ears relaxed. Lucas blinked, then smiled faintly, the first smile Sarah had seen from him all day. "Is he a police dog?" Lucas asked, his voice soft but bright with wonder. "Yeah," Michael said, stepping closer. "He's been with me for 3 years. He's trained to find people, to help keep the community safe, and to be my best friend on every shift." Lucas's eyes widened a little as Shadow sniffed the air and then gently pressed his nose to the boy's small hand. The boy's fingers trembled, then curled into the fur between Shadow's ears. "He's warm," Lucas whispered, "and soft." "I've never met a police dog before," Michael smiled. "He likes you," he said. "You're pretty special." Sarah moved to stand near the head of the bed, her hand lightly on Lucas's shoulder. She looked tired but relieved to see her son's expression brighten. Michael glanced around the room, noticing details that told him about the boy beyond the illness. On the shelf sat a line of miniature police cars, arranged by color. A child's drawing of a badge with Lucas scrawled under it was pinned to a corkboard. A small action figure of a police officer stood guard beside the TV remote. "You like police stuff?" Michael asked. Lucas nodded. "I've always wanted to be a cop when I grow up. I like the cars and the uniforms. I like the dogs best. My mom got me those cars when we had to come here. I play with them when I'm tired." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He crouched beside the bed so his eyes were level with Lucas's. "You know, Shadow didn't always know how to do what he does. He learned it little by little, with patience, kind of like how you're learning to be strong every day." Shadow lay down beside the bed, curling his body so that his head rested near Lucas's pillow. The boy shifted slightly and reached out again, his small hand resting on the dog's neck. Michael told him stories about training days at the K9 facility, about how Shadow learned to track scents in the snow, how he once found a missing hiker in the mountains at night, how he can tell the difference between friendly and suspicious behavior just by smell. Lucas listened, eyes wide, occasionally glancing at his mother as if to make sure this wasn't a dream. A nurse entered quietly, pushing a small cart of supplies. She was in her late 20s, her brown hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing blue scrubs under a warm cardigan. She nodded politely to Michael and Shadow, then smiled at Lucas. "Looks like you've got special visitors today," she said softly. She adjusted Lucas's IV, checked the monitor, and left without interrupting further. Lucas reached over to the small nightstand and picked up a plastic police badge on a string. He handed it to Michael. "I wear this sometimes." "Makes me feel like I'm part of it." Michael accepted it gently. "This is a fine badge," he said, pinning it to his jacket for a moment. "I think Shadow approves." Shadow wagged his tail once, a slow sweep against the floor. They spent a few more minutes like that, Michael telling gentle stories, Lucas stroking Shadow's fur, Sarah watching as color crept back into her son's cheeks. Finally, Michael rose, brushing his knees. "We don't want to tire you out," he said softly. "But if it's all right with your mom and the doctors, Shadow and I could stop by again after my shifts." Lucas's eyes brightened. "Really? He can come again?" Michael nodded. "I think he'd like that." He glanced at Sarah, who gave a silent nod of gratitude. Shadow stood and gave himself a quick shake, then leaned forward and licked Lucas's hand once, a warm, deliberate gesture. Lucas giggled, a soft, surprised sound that seemed to fill the sterile room with something human. Michael took a step back, letting the moment settle. Snow continued to drift past the window, and the faint sound of carols echoed from the corridor outside. For the first time that day, Sarah exhaled and smiled at her son without forcing it. Michael spoke softly. "We'll see you soon, Lucas." He tapped the brim of his jacket like a salute. Shadow gave a small chuff, tail wagging. They turned toward the door, leaving behind a room that felt a little less like a hospital and a little more like a place of possibility. Snow continued to cling to the town of Riverton like a second skin, and the hospital, with its pastel murals and polished floors, became a routine stop for Michael Turner and Shadow. In the days following their first meeting with Lucas Collins, Michael found himself rearranging his shifts so that each afternoon ended at Riverton Children's Hospital. His patrol SUV became almost as familiar to the staff as the ambulance bays. Shadow had started to wag his tail every time they turned down the street toward the hospital, as if he already knew the destination. Michael, 35, still looked every inch the Marine-turned officer, broad shoulders under his navy winter jacket, hair cropped short, but the hard lines around his eyes had softened. He no longer entered the hospital like an investigator. He entered like a guest, bringing warmth. Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd with sable and black fur and a calm, intelligent gaze, had also begun to adjust his behavior. He seemed to lower his energy, padding quietly through the halls, his ears relaxed, eyes scanning for Lucas instead of suspects. Each visit began in the parking lot. Michael would load a canvas tote with simple items: coloring books, bright markers, a rubber ball, sometimes a small wooden puzzle or a stack of paper for origami. He had even asked his sister, a teacher in another state, to send him children's books with police dog stories. The tote became known among the nurses as the Kit of Hope. Inside the pediatric ward, staff began to recognize Michael and Shadow. One orderly, Ben Alvarez, a 40-year-old originally from New Mexico with a stocky build and a kind smile, often held the elevator for them. He wore scrubs patterned with cartoon bears and had a habit of humming low songs while pushing supply carts. Ben had worked at the hospital for nearly a decade, coming from a family of nurses, and he loved animals. When he saw Shadow, he always crouched to scratch behind the dog's ears before heading off on his rounds. Lucas's room slowly transformed over the days. Sarah Collins, still pale with exhaustion but buoyed by a hint of hope, started decorating the space with small touches: a new blanket in Lucas's favorite color blue, a photo of their old Labrador taped to the wall, a paper banner with Lucas's name cut out in block letters. The nurses allowed these changes because Lucas's mood was improving. Michael entered each afternoon with Shadow trotting beside him. Lucas would already be waiting, sitting up a little higher in bed than before, his IV stand next to him but no longer overshadowing his small frame. His smile would break across his face the moment he saw the pair. The visits became small rituals. Michael would set the tote bag on the nightstand and unpack something new each time. One day, it might be a coloring book of police cars, the next a small foam ball for tossing back and forth. Lucas's thin fingers would curl around the toys with trembling but eager movements. Shadow would climb onto the bed with deliberate care, placing one paw at a time and waiting for Lucas's nod before lying down. They developed games. Michael would hide a toy somewhere in the room and give Shadow a command in a low voice. Shadow would sniff around, ears twitching, and then find the toy and place it gently in Lucas's lap. The boy's laugh, though soft, filled the room more strongly each day. Sometimes Shadow would roll onto his side so Lucas could scratch his belly, a privilege few outside the K9 unit ever received. During one visit, Michael brought a small sketch pad and a box of crayons. "Ever tried making your own police badge?" he asked. Lucas grinned and started to draw, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He drew Shadow with wings again, then himself wearing a police cap, then Michael beside him. "We're a team," Lucas whispered. Sarah often sat in a chair near the window during these sessions, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of hospital coffee. She began to chat with Michael haltingly at first about her life before Riverton, how she'd worked as a receptionist at a dental office, how Lucas had once loved to play soccer in the backyard. Sometimes her eyes would mist when she spoke of the backyard. Shadow would occasionally leave Lucas's side to nudge her knee, reminding her she wasn't invisible. The nurses started to comment on the change. One afternoon, a pediatric oncologist named Dr. Elaine Morris, in her early 40s with a neat pixie haircut and a long white coat, stepped into the room. She had been overseeing Lucas's treatment since he'd been admitted. Originally from Chicago, she had moved to Colorado for the mountain air and a slower pace of life. Her voice was steady and low, practiced in calming frightened parents. She watched for a moment as Lucas and Shadow played with a foam ball. "He's brighter," she murmured to Sarah, "more engaged." "That's good for his immune system." Michael introduced himself properly to Dr. Morris. She smiled faintly. "I've read about therapy animals. But it's rare to see a canine like this in action. Keep doing what you're doing." Officer Turner Lucas beamed at the acknowledgement. "Shadow's not just any dog," he said. "He's my friend." Shadow, as if understanding, wagged his tail once and placed his paw lightly on Lucas's knee. Michael started using their visits as small lessons. He'd bring simple puzzles and ask Lucas to time how long Shadow took to find a hidden object. He'd explain how scent trails worked and how police dogs could track footprints even after a snowstorm. Lucas absorbed every word, his mind sparking with the curiosity of a boy who had dreamed of wearing a badge. One evening, Michael arrived after a long day on patrol. His uniform smelled faintly of cold and engine oil. He had barely slept, but he still showed up with a small paper bag. Inside was a model police car he had picked up from a local hobby shop, painted in the Riverton PD colors. "For your collection," he said. Lucas's eyes widened and he held it close to his chest. Shadow began to pick up on Lucas's rhythms. He'd approach the bed slowly, wait for Lucas to pat the blanket, then curl up beside him. The dog learned to rest his head gently across Lucas's legs without pressing too hard, and Lucas began to run his small fingers over Shadow's fur with familiarity. By the end of the third week, the room no longer felt like a place of defeat, but like a clubhouse. Nurses stopped in just to say hello. Ben Alvarez sometimes brought small snacks for Shadow or refilled Sarah's coffee. Even Dr. Morris popped her head in more frequently to watch Lucas's progress. Michael noticed something else too. His own heart was changing. At first, he had come out of a sense of duty, but now he came because he wanted to. He found himself thinking about Lucas during patrol, wondering what new game he could bring next, or whether Shadow's presence was making a measurable difference. Shadow, meanwhile, had gone from cautious canine to gentle therapy dog without any formal retraining. The German shepherd seemed to know when to be playful and when to be still, how to lower his energy to match the fragile boy's. On one visit, Sarah whispered to Michael as Lucas dozed off after playing with Shadow. "He used to cry himself to sleep every afternoon," she said. "Now, he asks when you're coming back." Michael didn't know what to say. He reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears, watching the dog's head lift and then settle again at the foot of the bed. Outside, snow continued to fall over Riverton, layering the world in white. Inside the hospital room, warmth flickered between a boy, a mother, a police officer, and a dog who somehow bridged the gap between them all. The first rays of winter sun cut through the pale clouds over Riverton, casting a fragile warmth on the children's hospital. Snow still lined the ledges and the pine trees across the street, but the morning was clear enough to see the ridges of the Rockies in the distance. Inside Lucas's room, the blinds were half open, spilling a weak gold light onto the sheets. Michael Turner stood at the foot of the bed, Shadow at his side, while Sarah Collins straightened her son's blanket. Today was different. They had permission to leave the room for a little while. Sarah's voice was soft but hopeful as she spoke. "He's always wanted to plant sunflowers," she said. "We never got the chance." She glanced at Michael, her tired eyes reflecting a hint of excitement. "He talks about it sometimes, says he wants to see something grow." Michael nodded, adjusting the strap of Shadow's harness. "We're making it happen today," he said. The harness had a small pouch attached where a ceramic pot nestled snugly. Inside, a young sunflower sprout from Michael's backyard. He'd thought about it for days, finally digging it out of a garden patch at home and wrapping it carefully for transport. Shadow shifted slightly, his paws silent on the tile. He had grown used to the hospital routines, greeting the nurses with a slow wag of his tail and waiting for Lucas's hand to reach out before moving closer. A nurse entered the room, Kelly Ramirez, a 29-year-old originally from Denver with a quick smile and dark hair in a braided ponytail. She wore green scrubs under a fleece vest embroidered with the hospital logo. Kelly had been working in pediatrics for 3 years and was known for advocating special requests for her young patients. She smiled at Lucas, then at Michael. "Everything's ready on the balcony," she said. "I've set up a chair and a little table. It's chilly but sunny. Just don't stay out too long." Lucas's face lit up. His cheeks, once pale, now held a trace of color thanks to the past weeks of visits. "Really?" "Outside," he whispered. "Outside, Dad," Michael confirmed. "And Shadow's coming too." Kelly helped detach Lucas from one of the monitoring cables, leaving only the essential IV line. She maneuvered his stand into a portable version. Michael carefully picked up the small bag of supplies: a trowel, some soil, a watering can, while Sarah wrapped a scarf around Lucas's neck. They moved slowly through the hallway. Nurses and staff looked up and smiled as they passed, the little procession making its way to the double doors at the end of the wing. Michael held the door open while Shadow trotted ahead, nose lifting to the scent of cold air and sunshine. The balcony was small but bright, with a waist-high railing lined in frost. From here one could see the snow-draped town and, beyond it, the pine forests marching up toward the mountains. A faint breeze lifted Lucas's hair as he stepped onto the balcony, eyes wide. It was the first time in weeks he had felt fresh air against his skin. Michael set the pot with the sunflower sprout on the table and crouched beside it. "You ready to plant?" he asked. Lucas nodded vigorously. "Yes." His voice had more energy than Michael had ever heard. Shadow stood beside the boy, his sable coat gleaming in the sunlight. The dog's breath puffed white in the cold, and he watched intently as Michael unpacked the small trowel and bag of soil. Michael showed Lucas how to scoop soil into the pot, pressing it gently around the sprout. "Not too tight," he said. "The roots need space to breathe." Lucas, though still weak, concentrated fiercely, his small hands steady as he worked. Sarah knelt on the other side, holding the IV stand steady while helping guide his hands. Shadow lay down at Lucas's feet, head resting on his paws, eyes tracking every movement. Occasionally he shifted his weight or gave a low chuff, as though offering encouragement. His ears flicked toward the town below, then back to the boy. Kelly stood at the doorway with her arms folded, watching the scene. "I haven't seen him this excited in months," she murmured. Michael smiled, feeling something ease in his chest. "Sunlight, fresh air, and a dog," he said. "That's medicine, too." Lucas reached for the small watering can. "Can I?" "Go ahead," Michael said. Lucas tilted the can, dribbling water over the soil. The sprout shivered slightly, its tiny leaves catching the light. "We'll watch it grow every day," Lucas whispered. "Right, Shadow?" Shadow lifted his head, wagging his tail once as if answering. Sarah's eyes glistened. "Thank you," she said to Michael. "He's been talking about sunflowers for so long." "I couldn't make it happen." Michael shook his head. "You're making it happen." "I'm just here to help." For a few minutes they simply stood there. A mother, her son, a police officer, and a dog, while the winter sun warmed their faces. The sounds of the hospital faded, replaced by the hush of snowmelt dripping from the railing. Then, Lucas said, almost shyly, "Can Shadow have some of my cookie?" He pulled a small packet from his pocket, one of the snacks Ben Alvarez had given him earlier. Michael smiled. "A small piece is fine." Lucas broke off a crumb and offered it. Shadow took it delicately, then licked Lucas's fingers. Kelly came forward, checking her watch. "Time to go back in soon. We don't want you getting chilled." Lucas nodded but kept his eyes on the sprout. "I'll come see you tomorrow," he whispered to the plant. Michael packed up the tools while Sarah adjusted Lucas's scarf. Shadow stood and stretched, shaking out his coat before padding beside Lucas as they made their way back to the room. Inside, the hospital seemed brighter. Nurses smiled as the group passed, and one of them remarked, "You brought spring with you." Back in the room, Lucas climbed onto the bed, tired but glowing. Michael set the potted plant on the windowsill where it could catch sunlight. Shadow sat on the floor beside him, leaning gently against Sarah's legs. Michael crouched by Lucas's bed. "Next time," he said, "we'll bring another flower, or maybe a small herb plant." "You can have a whole garden here," Lucas beamed. "I'd like that." Shadow wagged his tail once more, then settled, his head on his paws. The plant on the windowsill stood like a promise, a small green flag of hope against the white of winter. The next week in Riverton dawned with snow still covering the sidewalks but the sky clear, a thin sun glinting off hospital windows. Michael Turner parked his patrol SUV in the same space he'd been using every afternoon and glanced at Shadow in the rear seat. The German Shepherd was already leaning forward, ears up, recognizing the hospital entrance. Yet today, Michael had another task before the afternoon visit with Lucas. Although his bond with Lucas and Sarah had grown, Michael's original assignment hadn't disappeared. Riverton Children's Hospital had lost another infusion pump over the weekend, and the chief wanted progress. Michael had arranged to meet the hospital's facility supervisor, Howard Kramer, a man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, a thin mustache, and a faded blue maintenance jacket. Kramer had worked at the hospital for 20 years, originally from Ohio, and carried himself with the slow weariness of someone who'd seen every leak and break in the building. Inside the hospital basement, the air smelled of cleaning solution and old pipes. The storage area was a maze of locked cages and labeled boxes. Michael clipped Shadow's leash shorter and let the dog sniff around. Kramer walked alongside them, jangling a ring of keys. "We've had tight security for years," he muttered, "but whoever's taking these units knows exactly where to go." No forced entry, no broken locks. Shadow lowered his head and began sniffing near a row of crates. Michael watched the dog carefully. Shadow's tail stiffened, nostrils flaring as he moved from one crate to another. Michael had trained with him long enough to see the difference between casual interest and a scent hit. "Get something?" Michael asked under his breath. Shadow flicked an ear but kept his nose pressed to the seam of a door at the end of the corridor. A small metal panel labeled "Authorized Personnel Only." Kramer noticed. "That's one of our technical storage rooms." Only a handful of people have keys. Michael crouched, examining the floor. A faint smear of something dark, maybe grease, marked the tile near the threshold. "I'll need to see the access logs," he said. "And the staff list." Kramer nodded slowly. "You'll want to talk to Derek Lane," he said. "He's one of our biomedical techs. Been here 5 years, good with machines, quiet guy." Later that afternoon, Michael and Shadow returned upstairs to Lucas's room, where Sarah had hung a small string of fairy lights above the window. Lucas was propped up with a sketch pad in his lap, drawing a comic strip of a superhero dog saving a city from villains. When he saw Michael, he grinned. "Shadow," he called weakly. "Come here." Shadow trotted to the bedside, placing his head near Lucas's hand. Michael sat down, removing his gloves. "You know, partner," he said to Lucas, "we're working on a mystery downstairs." Lucas's eyes lit up. "Really? Like a case?" "Exactly," Michael said. He kept his tone light but gave enough detail to make it vivid. "Someone's been sneaking out special machines." "We're trying to find out who." Lucas's thin fingers tightened around his pencil. "Do you have clues?" Michael chuckled. "Shadow does." He followed a smell right to a storage room. "Now we have to figure out who's been inside." Shadow, as if on cue, gave a soft huff and looked at Lucas. Michael raised his eyebrows theatrically. "See? He's telling you something." Lucas giggled, covering his mouth with his hand. "What's he saying?" Michael lowered his voice conspiratorially. "He says the culprit left behind a scent, and he's going to track it." He tapped Shadow's harness. "Every good detective needs a partner who can smell the truth." Sarah watched the exchange from the chair by the window. Her face was still drawn from exhaustion, but her eyes glowed with relief as she saw Lucas engaged. "He's been drawing comics about you two," she said quietly. "He calls Shadow Detective Paw." Michael laughed. That's a good name. He leaned closer to Lucas. Want to hear how a real investigation works? Lucas nodded eagerly. Michael began to describe, in child-friendly terms, how he and Shadow followed scent trails, how they checked security logs, how they looked for tiny signs like scratches on locks or misplaced items. He made it sound like a treasure hunt, his words painting scenes of secret doors and hidden evidence. Shadow played along, shifting his weight and glancing around the room as if searching for invisible clues. When Michael gave a soft whistle, Shadow sat up straight, then nodded his head in a movement that made Lucas laugh so hard he coughed. Michael immediately softened his tone, letting Lucas catch his breath. "Detective Paw is on the case," Lucas whispered, patting Shadow's back. "He'll catch the bad guy." Michael glanced at Sarah, who smiled faintly. She mouthed, "Thank you." Later, Michael stepped into the hallway to take a phone call from his sergeant. Derek Lane, the biomedical tech, had agreed to meet him tomorrow to answer some questions. Michael tucked the phone away and returned to the room, where Lucas was now showing Shadow a drawing of a badge. "This is yours," Lucas said solemnly. "Detective Paw." Michael crouched down, examining the drawing. It showed a big dog with a magnifying glass standing next to a boy with a cape. Michael felt the lump in his throat again. "Looks just like him," he said softly. The afternoon faded into evening. Snow began to drift again outside the window, covering the ledges with soft white. Michael packed up the coloring books and said his goodbyes, promising Lucas that Shadow would report back with new clues on their next visit. Lucas gave a tired but happy nod, clutching the badge drawing to his chest. As Michael and Shadow walked back to the SUV, he felt the dual pull of his two worlds. The crime he still needed to solve, and the boy whose spirits lifted with each story of pursuit and justice. Shadow glanced up at him, tail swaying once. Michael reached down to scratch behind his ears. "We're making progress," he murmured, "in more ways than one." The call came just after dawn, before Riverton's winter sky had shifted from black to gray. Michael Turner arrived at the hospital's underground loading dock with Shadow padding beside him, both of them exhaling steam in the cold. Carla Jensen, the auburn-haired patrolwoman in her dark jacket, stood waiting near the security office with Officer Raymond Cook, the hospital's veteran guard in his gray uniform. Their faces were set with determination. Overnight, another infusion pump had gone missing, and this time they had Derek Lane on camera. Michael adjusted his gloves and glanced at Shadow. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was tense but calm, his sable coat fluffed against the cold. He'd been tracking this scent for weeks. Carla handed Michael a printout from the security feed. Caught him moving equipment at 11:43 p.m. He swiped in but not out. Her voice was steady, eyes sharp. Cook added quietly, "We've locked down the exits. He's inside." They moved down the narrow hallway lined with pipes and storage cages. The metal door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only" loomed ahead, the same door Shadow had alerted on before. Michael gave a silent hand signal. Shadow's ears pricked, nose lowering to the seam of the door. Michael knocked firmly. "Derek Lane, Riverton PD. We need to talk." Silence, then a scrape of movement. The door cracked open to reveal Derek Lane, mid-30s, thin and pale, wearing a blue maintenance jumpsuit with the hospital logo. He had the anxious eyes of a man caught in his own trap. Originally from a small Colorado town, Derek had once been an EMT but left the field after debts and personal struggles mounted. "Step out of the room, sir," Michael said. Derek hesitated, eyes darting. When he tried to shut the door, Shadow lunged forward with a deep bark at Michael's command. Carla swung around to block Derek's escape while Cook raised a warrant. "We have probable cause," he said sharply. Inside the storage room, stacked behind a false panel, were 2 missing infusion pumps and a box of pediatric monitors. Michael snapped photos, bagged the items as evidence. Carla cuffed Derek, reading him his rights as he muttered about bad decisions. Shadow sat at Michael's side, chest heaving, tail still. Michael leaned down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Good boy," he whispered. The case that had begun weeks ago was finally closed. The hospital equipment would be returned, and someone would face justice. By the time Michael finished the paperwork with Carlin Cook, the sun had crept higher, throwing gold across the snow outside. He wiped his hands, straightened his jacket, and headed upstairs. Shadow trotted beside him, demeanor shifting back to calm as they approached Lucas's room. 3 months later, Riverton had moved from deep winter to early spring. Snow still lined the gutters, but patches of grass showed through. Inside Lucas's room, the sunflower on the sill had grown tall, a green stalk topped by a bright gold bloom. Lucas himself was stronger now, his cheeks fuller, eyes alert. Sarah sat at the window, knitting the blue blanket she had promised for Shadow, her scarf loosened as though the weight on her shoulders had eased. Dr. Elaine Morris entered wearing her white coat over a soft sweater, her pixie-cut hair tucked under a knit cap. She held a clipboard but smiled at them instead of glancing down. "Good news," she said. "Your latest scans show the tumor markers have dropped dramatically. His immune system is much stronger. I can't explain it fully, but something you're doing is helping." Sarah covered her mouth, tears spilling. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Dr. Morris nodded. "I'm sure." Lucas beamed up at Michael and Shadow sitting up taller in his bed. "Detective Paw caught the bad guy, didn't he?" he asked. Michael crouched, his storm-gray eyes soft. "He sure did," he said. He described in child-friendly terms how Shadow had tracked the scent, how they'd found the hidden machines and stopped the thief. Lucas listened as if to a bedtime story, eyes wide. "Detective Paw saved the hospital," he whispered, touching the cardboard badge still pinned to Shadow's harness. Michael smiled. "And now he's here to train his favorite recruit." That afternoon, Michael introduced a new K9 drill, a simple sit-stay-fetch routine using a soft foam baton. Lucas, wearing his tiny navy hoodie uniform, raised his thin arm and gave the command. "Sit," he said, voice steadier. Shadow obeyed immediately. "Stay." The dog froze. "Come!" The German Shepherd bounded forward, gently taking the baton and laying it on Lucas's lap. They repeated the exercise until Lucas was laughing, cheeks flushed with effort. Sarah watched from the chair, her hands clasped, whispering, "He's moving again. He's really moving." Michael adjusted the difficulty, adding a hand signal for spin and another for search. Shadow performed each slowly, allowing Lucas to follow along. Each small victory seemed to feed the boy's strength. As the afternoon light shifted, Carla stopped by the room still in her patrol jacket, auburn hair pulled back, smiling at the sight of Lucas and Shadow training. "Looks like we've got a future K9 officer here," she said. Lucas grinned and saluted her with 2 fingers. Shadow lay down beside the bed, head on his paws, watching his young friend. Michael stood near the window, looking out at the snow-speckled town and thinking about how far they had come, from the day he'd stumbled upon a crying mother in a hallway to this small miracle of hope. The sunflower caught the last of the light, its petals glowing like a promise. Michael felt a rare sense of completeness. The case solved, the boy recovering, the dog bridging 2 worlds. Spring had arrived in Riverton with an almost tender insistence. Snow lingered only in the high gullies of the mountains, while the hospital grounds had turned green with new grass and early wildflowers. The sunflower Lucas had planted a year ago had lived out its cycle, but Sarah had saved the seeds in a paper envelope, a small promise folded into her purse. In Lucas's room, the machines were gone. The boy, who had once been tethered to IV lines, was now a boy in motion, laughing, his shoes squeaking on the polished hospital corridors. Michael Turner walked across the hospital courtyard with Shadow trotting beside him, the dog's coat shining in the sun. Michael still wore his Navy patrol jacket, but with a lighter step, his storm-gray eyes warmed by the sight of Lucas running ahead with a ball in his hands. Sarah stood under a budding tree nearby, watching her son with a smile so wide it seemed to erase years of worry. Lucas's hair had grown back into a soft blonde mop, and his cheeks were round and pink from fresh air and exercise. Today he wore a small navy blue hoodie with a sewn-on patch Sarah had crafted, a cartoon version of Shadow with a magnifying glass. In his pocket was a plastic badge Michael had given him months ago, worn from being carried every day. Michael had arranged something special. With the help of the hospital staff and a few officers from Riverton PD, he had set up a graduation day in the hospital park, a grassy square lined with benches and a small gazebo. Paper banners fluttered between the trees. "Congratulations, Lucas," and "Our brave K-9 cadet." Nurses, doctors, and a few other young patients had gathered, some in wheelchairs, some with bandanas over their heads, all watching as Lucas and Shadow played. Carla Jensen arrived wearing a crisp navy shirt and jeans, her auburn hair loose today. She had brought balloons and a small cake decorated with paw prints. "You ready for the ceremony?" she asked Michael. "More than ready," Michael replied. He glanced down at Shadow. The German shepherd's ears twitched. He seemed to understand this was an important day. Ben Alvarez, the kindly hospital orderly from the pediatric wing, also stood nearby, still in his scrubs with cartoon bears. He had taken an early lunch break to be there, carrying a camera borrowed from the hospital media team. "Let's get some good shots for the newsletter," he said, smiling. Dr. Elaine Morris stepped out from the hospital doors wearing a light blue blazer instead of her white coat, her pixie-cut hair catching the sunlight. She had seen Lucas's journey from the beginning and now watched with quiet pride. She carried a certificate rolled into a blue ribbon. "I never thought I'd get to do something like this," she admitted to Sarah. Sarah wore a simple floral dress under a cardigan, her hair brushed and falling loose over her shoulders. She looked younger than she had in years, the lines of tension gone from her face. She held the envelope of sunflower seeds in one hand as though it were a talisman. Michael called Lucas over. "Hey, cadet," he said, crouching to the boy's level. "You ready for your graduation?" Lucas grinned, eyes bright. "Yes, sir." Shadow sat beside him, tail sweeping the grass. The small crowd gathered under the gazebo. Michael cleared his throat. "When we first met Lucas," he began, "he was fighting one of the toughest battles any kid can face. He showed courage, patience, and heart. He became Shadow's favorite recruit, and he taught all of us about hope." Carla stepped forward holding a small velvet box. Inside was a custom-made Junior K-9 honor badge, a shiny emblem with Lucas's name engraved on it and a tiny paw print beside it. "This is for our bravest cadet," she said. Michael pinned the badge to Lucas's hoodie. "Lucas Collins," he said formally, "by the authority of the Riverton Police Department K-9 Unit, we name you Honorary Junior K-9 Officer for your courage and spirit." Shadow gave a deep bark, startling and delighting the crowd. Lucas beamed, patting the dog's neck. "Thank you," he whispered. Dr. Morris then presented the rolled certificate. "And from Riverton Children's Hospital," she said, "we celebrate your journey and your example to other patients." Ben Alvarez snapped photos while Carla handed out slices of cake. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks, smiling so hard she could barely speak. "You're amazing," she whispered to Lucas. Lucas held up his badge to the crowd. "Detective Paw and I will keep fighting," he declared, making the younger kids laugh and clap. Shadow wagged his tail like a flag. After the ceremony, Michael took Lucas and Shadow to a corner of the hospital park where a small flower bed had been prepared. "Remember the sunflower?" Michael asked. "Time to plant its seeds." Lucas knelt with Sarah's help, scattering the saved seeds into the earth. Shadow lay nearby, chin on his paws, eyes half closed in the sun. Carla crouched beside them, pressing the soil gently. "New beginnings," she murmured. The hospital administration had decided to feature Lucas's story on their website and in local news, calling it the K-9 Miracle. Posters with Lucas and Shadow's photo appeared in hallways as inspiration to other patients. Nurses began referring to the balcony garden as Lucas's Corner, and more children asked to plant seeds of their own. As the afternoon light softened, Michael stood back and watched. He saw not just a boy in remission, but a ripple effect. Other parents smiling, children reaching for the dirt, staff members believing a little more in the intangible. Shadow, sensing the calm, moved closer to Michael and leaned against his leg. Sarah turned to Michael, her voice low. "We're going to keep this going," she said. "He wants to come back and visit other kids, Bring Shadow if you'll let him." Michael nodded. "We'll make it happen." Lucas, crouched over the soil, looked up and grinned. "Detective Paw's garden," he said. The sun slid lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the park. The banners fluttered, the balloons bobbed, and the badge on Lucas's hoodie glinted in the fading light. Michael felt something settle inside him, the sense of a circle closing, a promise kept. Shadow lifted his head high, ears forward, chest out, as if posing for the final photo of the day. Lucas mimicked him, standing tall, badge shining. In that moment, boy and dog looked like partners ready for whatever came next. The hospital courtyard smelled of grass and wet earth after a spring rain. Clouds parted to let the sun through, painting the sidewalks with bright puddles. Michael Turner leaned against his patrol SUV, Shadow sitting tall beside him, as Sarah Collins walked out the main doors with Lucas in tow. This time, there was no IV stand, no nurse hovering nearby. Lucas was wearing jeans and a light hoodie with the Junior K9 badge pinned proudly on the front. His blonde hair fluttered in the breeze. It had been 1 full year since the first day Michael and Shadow walked down the pediatric ward and found Sarah crying on a plastic bench. Now Lucas was officially being discharged, not just for a weekend, but for good. Dr. Elaine Morris had signed the papers herself, smiling with tears in her eyes as she said goodbye. "You're one of my miracles," she had whispered to Lucas, handing him a small certificate that said, "Courage Award." As Lucas bounded down the steps, Sarah followed, wearing a simple pale green dress under a denim jacket. Her hair, once always tied back, now hung loose around her shoulders. She clutched a manila folder of discharge documents, but kept glancing at Michael and Shadow with a soft smile. Michael crouched as Lucas ran to him. "Hey, cadet," he said. "Ready for freedom?" Lucas grinned. "Ready." Shadow wagged his tail and pressed his head into the boy's chest, earning a giggle. Sarah reached them and stopped, her eyes glistening. "I don't know how to say this," she murmured. "Thank you will never be enough." She crouched, wrapping her arms around both Michael and Shadow at once, tears spilling freely. "You saved my boy's life," she whispered. "Both of you." Michael smiled, a little embarrassed. "You both did the hard work," he said softly. "We just showed up." Shadow leaned into Sarah's embrace, tail wagging. Later that week, at the Riverton Police Department, Michael completed the paperwork to adopt Shadow officially. The German Shepherd had served 5 dedicated years in the K9 unit and was due for early retirement due to mild arthritis in his back legs. With the chief's blessing, Shadow moved from Officer Shadow to Michael's dog on paper, though in reality he'd been Michael's partner all along. Michael set up a small corner of his living room with Shadow's harness, toys, and a framed photo of the dog with Lucas at graduation day. He also began coordinating with the hospital's pediatric program to bring Shadow back as a therapy visitor once a week. 2 months after Lucas's discharge, the hospital hosted a fundraising gala called Garden of Hope. The event was held in a converted community hall, decorated with strings of lights and potted plants donated by local nurseries. Volunteers bustled about arranging tables. Among them was Janet Ruiz, a 45-year-old community organizer from Riverton who had spearheaded the hospital's outreach programs. Janet wore a dark blue dress and a lanyard heavy with name tags, her hair in a sleek bob. She had invited Lucas and Sarah as special guests. Michael arrived with Shadow on a loose leash. Shadow wore a new vest embroidered Therapy K9 and a small sunflower pin on his collar. The dog moved calmly through the crowd, greeting children and letting them pat his back. Lucas ran ahead, now stronger and taller, wearing a blazer over his hoodie with the Junior K9 badge still pinned. Sarah followed in a navy wrap dress, her expression proud and calm. Janet Ruiz introduced Lucas on stage. "Tonight we have someone very special," she said into the microphone. "A boy who inspired us all. Our very own Junior K9 officer, Lucas Collins." Lucas stepped up to the podium, gripping the sides nervously. He looked out at the faces, doctors, nurses, donors, and kids from the ward, then at Michael and Shadow in the front row. His voice was clear. "A year ago, I was in a hospital bed," he began. "I thought I wouldn't get to play outside again. But then Officer Michael and Shadow came. They gave me hope and helped me fight." He paused, glancing at Shadow, who wagged his tail once. "Shadow is my miracle," Lucas said simply. "He taught me to be brave." The audience applauded, some standing, some wiping their eyes. Michael felt something shift inside him, the quiet pride of someone seeing a circle close. He remembered the first time he'd entered Lucas's room. The pale boy, the crying mother, the sterile air, and contrasted it with this stage lit by warm bulbs, this boy standing tall, this dog still by his side. After the speech, Michael met them at the side of the stage. "You nailed it," he said softly. Lucas beamed. "Detective Paw and I did it together," he said. Shadow pressed his muzzle against Lucas's hand in a practiced gesture of affection. Sarah hugged Michael again, this time with laughter instead of tears. "You've become part of our family," she said. "Whether you like it or not." Michael laughed. "I like it," he said. The rest of the evening unfolded with music and small speeches. Janet Ruiz announced that the hospital was starting a new initiative called Lucas's Garden of Hope, a fund to support children's therapy programs, including animal-assisted activities. Lucas was named the youth ambassador for the fund. Posters of him and Shadow planting sunflowers were displayed around the hall. Shadow, calm amid the bustle, let child after child stroke his fur. Michael spoke quietly with donors about canine work, feeling a sense of purpose beyond patrol shifts. He realized that his badge meant more now, not just authority, but a bridge to kindness. As the night wound down, Michael stepped outside for a breath of cool air. The stars over Riverton glittered like frost. Sarah joined him, wrapping her cardigan tighter. "You know," she said, "Lucas wants to visit the hospital next week, with Shadow, to cheer up the new kids." Michael nodded, smiling. "We'll be there." Through the open doors they could hear Lucas's laughter mingling with the soft strum of a guitar from the stage. Shadow stood beside Michael, ears flicking, tail sweeping the ground. Michael glanced at the boy, the mother, the dog, and for a moment saw not patients and officers, but a family built from survival, kindness, and second chances. He felt the deep certainty that his work as a police officer had taken him here for a reason. Shadow leaned against his leg, eyes half closed, the sunflower pin on his collar glinting in the light from the hall. Michael rested a hand on his partner's head and smiled. Sometimes, he thought, the real arrests weren't of criminals, but of despair itself. This story reminds us that miracles are not always thunderclaps from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the warmth of a dog's fur, in the patience of a police officer, in the prayer of a mother who refuses to give up. It echoes the promise that God can work through ordinary people and everyday acts of kindness to heal hearts and bodies. In our own lives, we may never face the exact struggles of Lucas or Michael, but each of us can be the person who shows up, comforts, listens, and believes when hope seems lost. If this story touched your heart, please share it with a friend who needs encouragement. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe to our channel to keep spreading messages of hope. We invite you to write Amen in the comments as a prayer for children everywhere who are fighting their own battles. May God bless you and your family with health, peace, and unexpected miracles in your daily life.